Chief astronomer Vel O'Shanty had spent 11 years teaching her instruments to listen for silence. The homeworld of the Kathrani, a cracked orange marble called Dorith, had not seen unscheduled precipitation in 406 years. Every drop of water on the planet was accounted for, rationed, argued over in the assembly, and tracked by a network of satellites so sensitive they could register a spilled cup from orbit. So when the Western Monitoring Array recorded rainfall over the Caldrec Basin at 0347 local time, Vel assumed the machine had broken. It had not broken. It had counted correctly. 41 millimeters of rain had fallen in 9 minutes over 800 square kilometers of dead farmland, and no one on Dorith had asked for it, ordered it, or seen it coming. By dawn, the story was everywhere. Farmers who had not planted a crop in a decade were standing in mud up to their ankles, filming themselves with shaking hands. The water was clean. It was warm. It smelled, several witnesses reported with a kind of bewildered reverence, like nothing at all. No ozone, no chemical tang, no trace of the reclaimed sewage that the government sometimes euphemistically called supplemental irrigation. It was, by every measure Vel's team could run, the most perfect rain any of them had ever tasted. Vel did not sleep that night. She sat in the observatory with 6 of her researchers, running the numbers again and again, because the alternative to a broken instrument was something far stranger. Someone, somewhere, had reached across the dark between the stars and watered a dead field on a planet that had given up asking anyone for help. She was not the only one running numbers that night. Across the Assembly's territory, and far beyond it, in systems that had never shared so much as a trade agreement, the same question was being asked in a dozen languages by a dozen species who did not yet know they were asking it together. On the ice moon of Tessic, 400 light-years from Dorith, a fishing cooperative that had lost its coastal ice shelf to 2 decades of thinning cover woke to find that same ice a full meter thicker than it had been the night before, seated overnight by orbital platforms depositing precisely calculated snowfall across the shelf's weakest stretches. On the drought world of On-Era Prime, a religious order that had spent 3 generations praying for the return of the wet season filmed clouds gathering where no clouds had gathered in living memory, and argued for weeks afterward about whether the footage was a miracle, a hoax, or something in between that their theology had no word for yet. None of these communities knew about the others. None of them had asked their governments to investigate. It was the governments, watching their own instruments register the same inexplicable pattern within hours of each other, who first understood that this was not a local event at all. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. 3,000 light-years away, on a ship that had no reason to care about Kathrani farmland, Second Officer Priya Anand watched a status board turn green and felt nothing in particular. It was, to her, an unremarkable Tuesday. "Deployment complete," she said, mostly to herself, and flagged the report for her captain. Atmospheric seeding confirmed across all 12 target systems. No incidents. The Meridian Compact, Earth's small, chronically underfunded arm of interstellar diplomacy, had spent 4 years developing a weather engineering platform capable of triggering rainfall on a planetary scale from orbit, using nothing but seeded ice crystals, careful orbital mechanics, and an amount of patience that had nearly bankrupted the program twice. It was on the list of things humanity had built closer to a garden hose than a warship. Nobody in the Compact's small foreign office had thought to ask whether using it on someone else's planet, without asking first, might be received as anything other than a gift. That was the plan, at least the whole plan as far as the seeding division was concerned. 12 drought-stricken worlds, chosen from public agricultural distress reports that anyone with a working telescope could have pulled from open channels, watered on the same day as a demonstration that the technology worked and a gesture of goodwill toward species Earth had barely spoken to. No treaties, no fees, no demands, just water falling from a clear sky on worlds that badly needed it. Priya closed the report and went to get coffee. She did not know yet that she had just started a war. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. The Assembly of Interstellar Concord had existed for 160 years, and in that time it had developed exactly one skill with any real proficiency. It was extraordinarily good at being afraid of things it did not understand. This was not entirely its fault. The galaxy it governed, or tried to, was a crowded, suspicious place, stitched together out of species who had mostly met each other through the barrel of a weapon, and the Assembly's founding purpose had been to make sure that kept happening as rarely as possible. Its solution, over a century and a half, had been to build the most sensitive detection network in known space and to treat every anomaly as a threat until proven otherwise. 12 simultaneous, unexplained, technologically sophisticated weather events across 12 different star systems, none of which shared a border, a species, or an obvious water source, was exactly the kind of anomaly the Assembly's charter had been written to catch. Ambassador Threll Voss did not learn about the rain from an intelligence briefing. He learned about it from his daughter, who called him at his office on Dorotha's neighboring world of Kaith to tell him, breathless, that her cousins on the Caldrek Basin had water again, real water, and did he know anything about it? He did not. By the time he hung up, his office's secure channel was already lit with priority messages from 4 different Assembly worlds asking the same question in less patient language. The investigation that followed took 11 days, and it was, by any objective standard, thorough. Assembly forensic teams traced atmospheric particulate signatures back to orbital seeding platforms. They cross-referenced launch trajectories against every registered vessel in the region. They found, eventually, exactly what had happened. A human diplomatic and scientific mission, operating openly using technology it had never concealed, had deployed weather modification satellites over 12 worlds on the same calendar day. What the investigation did not do, what no investigation in the Assembly's history had ever been built to do, was ask the humans why. They did this to 12 worlds at once, said Assembly Councillor Prinkest, standing before the full chamber with the forensic report in her hand. 12. Not one world, tested carefully with consent obtained and observed for side effects. 12 simultaneously, across a volume of space no single fleet could patrol in a year. I ask this chamber to consider what that capability means if it is ever turned toward something other than rain. It was a good speech. It was, in fact, one of the most effective speeches given in the chamber in a decade, and it had one significant flaw. It was answering a question nobody had actually posed to the party best equipped to answer it. Prinkest had not asked the humans what they intended. She had asked the Assembly to imagine what the humans might intend, and the Assembly, true to its history, imagined the worst version available. The vote to authorize a precautionary deterrence action against the Meridian Compact passed with a margin that surprised even its sponsors. Asterisk. Ambassador Threll Voss voted against it, and it changed nothing, which was the part that would keep him awake for the rest of the war. He tried, in the days after the vote, to do what nobody else had bothered to do. He requested a direct channel to the Meridian Compact's Foreign Office. He got one, eventually routed through 3 intermediary relay stations and a translation lag that made every exchange feel like shouting into a canyon, and on the other end of it he found a very tired, very confused human named Director Owen Calloway, who kept asking him to repeat the question because he genuinely did not understand what he was being accused of. "You watered our farmland," Threll said, for the 3rd time. 12 worlds, without asking. And now my Assembly believes it was a demonstration. "It was a demonstration," Owen said, "of the tech working. We wanted people to see it function before we started charging money for it, so we picked the worst droughts we could find in open agricultural reports and ran the whole platform in one pass to prove the coordination held up across multiple systems. That's the whole strategy document, Ambassador. I can send it to you. It's 40 pages and about 30 of them are about crop yield projections." Threll sat with that for a long moment. "You did not intend it as a show of force. We intended it as a sales pitch," Owen said, with the particular exasperation of a man watching a catastrophic misunderstanding assemble itself in real time and being powerless to stop it. "We were going to lead with the flooded fields in the next meeting. Look what we can do for your farmers. Here's the invoice for doing it on purpose next time." That was the whole play. It was, Threll would later reflect, one of the more absurd conversations of his diplomatic career, and also one of the most honest ones, which was precisely why it did not matter. He forwarded the transcript to the Assembly chamber that same day. It was read into the record, noted, and set aside, because the Assembly's precautionary deterrence action was already 3 days underway, and a transcript explaining that a demonstrated capability for unilateral, simultaneous, multi-system planetary intervention had been intended as a marketing exercise did not, in the judgment of the War Council, make that capability less alarming. If anything, several counselors argued, it made it worse. A species with power like that, wielding it this casually without even the discipline of strategic intent, was arguably a greater long-term risk than one that had planned the demonstration as a threat. Threll Voss had discovered, in 11 days, the single flaw in the Assembly's excellent detection network. It could tell you exactly what had happened, down to the last particulate reading, and it had no mechanism whatsoever for asking why, and even less for believing the answer once it got one. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. The Assembly did not declare war the way humans understood the phrase, with speeches and formal instruments and a date that would be remembered. It authorized a precautionary deterrence action, which in practice meant assembling a joint task fleet from 6 member species and sending it toward the nearest Meridian Compact colony with orders to demand the immediate disclosure and surrender of all weather modification technology, backed by force if the demand was refused. The colony in question was a moon called Halden's Rest, population 11,000, whose primary economic activity was hydroponic agriculture supplying 3 nearby systems. It had, until 6 days earlier, been suffering through its own minor irrigation crisis after a reactor fault took 2 water reclamation plants offline. It had also, unbeknownst to the Assembly's targeting analysts, been on the very short list for the next round of seeding demonstrations, a fact that would matter a great deal later and mean nothing at all in the moment the fleet arrived. Captain Priya Anand, recently promoted, still getting used to the title, was 3 systems away running a routine seeding pass over an uninhabited moon when the distress call came through. She read it twice before she believed it. "They're demanding we hand over the seeding platforms," she said to her XO, "or they'll take the colony's water reclamation systems offline by force, as a deterrent." "That's not a deterrent," her XO said slowly. "That's a siege." "I know what it is." Priya was already redirecting course. "Get me Director Calloway, and get me everything we have on the Assembly fleet's composition, because I would like to know exactly how much of a fight 11,000 hydroponic farmers are about to be in." The numbers, when they came back, were not encouraging. 6 member species had contributed ships to the task fleet, which put its combined strength at something like 40 times what the compact could realistically move into the sector in the time available. Priya's own vessel, the Amara Sen, was a survey and seeding platform, built for atmospheric science rather than combat, carrying exactly enough point defense capability to knock down debris and nothing that anyone would call a weapon. She requisitioned every armed escort the compact had in 3 sectors anyway, not because she believed it would matter militarily, but because she was not going to let Halden's Rest sit alone in front of a war fleet while she waited for permission from people 3 weeks behind on the news. "If we can't win it," her XO said carefully, as the Amara sun burned hard for the colony, "what exactly are we flying into?" "We're flying into whatever happens before anyone decides to fire the first shot," Priya said. "That's the only part of this I think we can still change." Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. What happened at Halden's Rest over the following 6 days became, in later years, the single most retold episode of the war, partly because of what the Assembly fleet did, and mostly because of what it found when it got there. The task fleet arrived in system expecting resistance, some combination of military assets, defensive platforms, the kind of hardened perimeter a species might build around technology it considered strategically vital. What it found instead was a civilian mining and agriculture colony with 3 lightly armed system patrol craft, a reclamation infrastructure already damaged and limping, and a population that had spent the last 6 days watching the same forensic reports the Assembly chamber had, arriving at a rather different set of conclusions. Halden's Rest had seen the 12-world rainfall event. It had also seen, because Owen Calloway's 40-page strategy document had by then been leaked, republished, and read by roughly everyone in Meridian Compact space with an opinion to spare, exactly what the humans had actually intended by it. And it had spent those 6 days watching an Assembly fleet approach with orders to seize technology that, as far as the colony's engineers understood it, was the single most promising fix for the exact irrigation crisis currently threatening their food supply. When the fleet's flagship opened a channel to demand the colony's surrender of all weather modification assets, it was answered not by a military officer but by the colony's civilian administrator, a woman named Odalise Fenn, who had been up for 2 days straight trying to keep the reclamation plants running and did not, by her own later account, have the patience left to be diplomatic. "You want the platforms," she said. "Fine. They're not here. Compact seeding tech is deployed from orbital assets, not surface installations. You'd know that if your intelligence had spent 5 minutes reading the specs instead of the panic memos. But I'll tell you what is here. 11,000 people who've spent 6 days watching you point warships at a colony because we might get rained on. So before your fleet does whatever it came here to do, Maybe somebody over there should explain to 11,000 farmers why saving our crops is the thing you decided was worth a war. It was not a formal surrender demand refusal. It was not strictly anything the Assembly's protocols had a category for. But it was broadcast, unencrypted, across every channel the colony had access to, and within hours it had been picked up and relayed by every independent news service in a dozen systems, including several belonging to Assembly member worlds who were, it turned out, watching this unfold with considerably less appetite for it than their chamber representatives had assumed. The Amara Sen arrived in system 9 hours later, alone, its handful of borrowed escort craft still 2 days out. Priya brought it in on a slow, deliberate approach vector, transponder broadcasting openly weapons what few she had, powered down and logged as such on every channel the task fleet was monitoring. It was, her tactical officer pointed out, either the safest possible way to approach a war fleet or the single easiest way to get a survey ship destroyed without anyone having to explain why afterward. They're not going to fire on an unarmed science vessel broadcasting its own weapon status, Priya said, with more confidence than she entirely felt. They fired the deterrence order at 11,000 farmers over a rainstorm, her XO said. I wouldn't bet the ship on what they will and won't do. Nothing fired. For 6 days, the Amara Sun sat in orbit alongside the task fleet, close enough that Priya could watch the larger ships running lights from her own bridge, close enough that a single miscalculated order from either side could have started something neither government could have walked back. She spent those 6 days doing the only thing she could think of that might actually help. Talking. She opened a channel to the task fleet's flagship every few hours, whether or not anyone answered, and read into the record everything the compact had. Owen Calloway's strategy document, the crop yield projections, the seeding schedule that had, until 6 days earlier, quietly included Halden's Rest as its next stop. She was not trying to win an argument. She was trying to make sure that if the fleet's commanders eventually decided to look for a reason not to fire, one would be sitting in their queue already read, already understood, instead of arriving too late the way it had for the assembly chamber back on Kaith. The war did not end there, though it should have, a fact that later historians would spend considerable energy being frustrated about. Wars, once authorized, tend to acquire a momentum independent of the reasoning that started them, and the Assembly's task fleet had orders, a chain of command, and a mandate that did not evaporate simply because a tired colonial administrator had made an inconvenient point on an open channel. What changed over the following weeks was quieter and more consequential. The war stopped being fought against an enemy and started being fought, increasingly, against the Assembly's own member world's willingness to keep supplying it. Dorith, the very world where Velo Shanti had first logged the impossible rainfall, was one of the first to formally petition its representative to withdraw support for the deterrence action. It was not, its petition noted with some understatement, an easy position for the Assembly to defend. Asking a homeworld to help wage war against the species that had ended its 400-year drought was a difficult sell even before the leaked strategy document made clear the whole thing had been a well-meaning sales pitch gone catastrophically sideways. 6 other worlds followed within the month, each for its own reasons, each arriving at roughly the same uncomfortable conclusion Threlvas had reached in 11 days back at the start. The Assembly's detection network had told them exactly what happened and never once told them why, and by the time anyone had bothered to ask, the machinery of the response had already been running for weeks. Prin Kest, to her credit, did not abandon her position quietly. She argued, in chamber session after chamber session, that the capability demonstrated by the 12-world seeding event remained real regardless of the intent behind it, and that a species capable of reshaping planetary weather across a dozen systems in a single coordinated action deserved caution whether or not this particular use of it had been benign. It was not, on its own terms, an unreasonable argument. But it was an argument about capability, made to an assembly whose member worlds had started asking questions about consequence, and arguments about capability tend to lose ground once the people affected have started counting the actual cost in ships, credits, and goodwill. The task fleet at Halden's Rest received new orders 8 weeks after the deterrence action was first authorized. It was not called a retreat. It was called, in the language the Assembly preferred for such things, a reassessment of strategic posture, and it involved every ship in that fleet turning around and going home. Prin Kest did not attend the session where the order was read. She watched it from her own office, alone, and found that what she felt was not defeat so much as a kind of exhausted clarity. She had built her argument on a fact she still believed to be true, that a species capable of reshaping weather across a dozen systems at once was a species worth watching closely, whatever its intentions this time. She had simply never found a way to hold that fact alongside the other one, the one Threll Voss had understood within 11 days and she had taken 4 months to sit with. That watching closely and declaring war were not the same instrument, and the Assembly's charter had never quite taught anyone the difference. She drafted her resignation that evening. It was accepted without much ceremony, and she spent the following year, by her own account, learning to read intelligence reports for the questions they failed to ask rather than the answers they gave. The Amara Sun stayed in orbit around Halden's Rest for another 2 weeks after the fleet withdrew, not because it was needed there any longer, but because Priya Anand had, over 6 tense days of talking into a channel that might never answer, come to feel responsible for a colony that had never asked to be the place where a war either started or stopped. Odalise Fenn met her in person before the ship finally left, in a hydroponics bay smelling of recycled water and green growing things, and thanked her for something Priya was not entirely sure she deserved credit for. "You didn't stop the fleet," Odalise said. "We stopped the fleet. You just made sure they had somewhere else to look while they figured that out." "I'll take it," Priya said. ******. Owen Calloway sat across the table from Ambassador Threll Voss 4 months later, in a conference room on Caith that had, until recently, hosted the Assembly's own war council, and found that he still did not entirely know what to say. "I want to be clear," he said, "that we don't do this. The seeding program isn't some kind of statement. It's a public agricultural service. We picked 12 drought sites off open reports because they were the worst ones we could find, not because we wanted to prove a point." "I know," Threll said. "I believed you the first time. It did not matter the first time. I hope it matters more now." Owen turned a data pad over in his hands, not really looking at it. "Halden's Rest is still on the list, you know. The next round of seeding demonstrations. We never took it off." Threll looked up. "You intend to water it anyway. After all this." "They need it," Owen said simply. "The reclamation plants are still limping. 11,000 people and half their crops are on a countdown. The fact that a fleet showed up over a misunderstanding doesn't change what those farmers actually need." He set the pad down. "We're not going to stop doing this because it scared people. We're going to get better at explaining it first. That's the whole lesson as far as I can tell. Not that the technology's dangerous. That we were bad at telling people what it was for." Threll was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, Caith's sky was the same dull orange it had always been, unremarkable, unrained on. The kind of ordinary weather that had started an entire war by its absence somewhere else. "When you seed the rain there," he said eventually, "I would like Dorothy's atmospheric monitors granted access to your platform schedule in advance. Not to stop it. To warn the ground first, so no one mistakes it for something else." Owen looked at him for a long moment, and something in his face loosened, just slightly. The particular relief of a man who had spent 4 months bracing for a fight and found, instead, someone willing to build the thing that would prevent the next one. "Yeah," he said. "Yeah, we can do that." They spent the rest of that meeting doing something neither government had thought to do in the 4 months since the rain first fell. Building, line by line, a shared notification protocol that would let any world receiving a seeding pass know exactly what to expect, how long before it arrived, and who to call if something looked wrong. It was not a treaty. It was barely a page and a half. But it was the first document either side had produced that answered the question the Assembly's entire detection network had never been built to ask, and Threll Voss privately thought it might end up matching more than anything the War Council had drafted in 4 months of trying to prevent a fight that had, in the end, mostly prevented itself. Halden's Rest saw its scheduled rain 3 weeks later, and this time every farmer on the moon was standing outside to watch it fall, because they had been told, precisely, down to the hour, exactly when and where and why. There were no panicked broadcasts. There was no fleet in orbit. There was only warm, clean water falling on hydroponic fields that had needed it for months, and 11,000 people who had, for months earlier, been the site of a war's opening battle, standing in their own fields getting soaked and laughing about it. Velo Shanti watched the footage from her observatory on Dorith, replayed a dozen times across a dozen news channels, and thought about the night she had sat with 6 researchers trying to prove her instruments had broken, because the alternative, that someone out there had simply decided without being asked to help, had seemed at the time like the more unbelievable explanation. Still was a little, that she had come to think might be the whole point. The galaxy the Assembly had built its detection networks to protect had never had a category for generosity offered without a demand attached, and it had taken a war, a leaked strategy document, and one exhausted colonial administrator telling off a war fleet on an open channel to make room for one. She logged the rainfall data anyway, out of habit, the way she always had. 41 millimeters. Clean. Warm. No trace of anything but water. This time, nobody mistook it for anything else. Threll Voss watched the same footage from his office on Caith, sitting beside the thin, unremarkable notification protocol he and Owen Calloway had drafted 4 months earlier, now formally adopted by both governments and quietly copied by 2 more species who had been watching the whole affair from a cautious distance. It had taken a war neither side had wanted, 11 days of an investigation that answered every question except the one that mattered, and one exhausted colonial administrator's unscripted honesty on an open channel to produce a document that fit on a page and a half. He found that fact almost funny, in the way that only the aftermath of something nearly catastrophic could be funny. Not because it was light, but because the alternative to laughing at it was sitting with how easily it might have gone the other way. He thought, more than once in the months that followed, about the 11 days he had spent chasing an answer nobody else had thought to ask for, and about how close the whole affair had come to being decided before that answer ever reached anyone with the power to use it. The Assembly's networks had not failed. Exactly. They had done precisely what they were built to do. They had detected the rain, traced its source, and delivered a complete, accurate account of what had happened, faster and more thoroughly than any single investigator could have managed alone. What they had never been asked to deliver was a reason to believe the account once they had it, and that gap between knowing what a thing was and understanding why it had been done was where the war had lived the whole time, feeding on 11 days of silence before anyone thought to fill it. He did not think the gap would close on its own, but he had come to believe, watching Halden's Rest get properly, peacefully rained on 3 weeks after nearly being besieged over it, that it could be narrowed 1 notification at a time, 1 page and a half protocol at a time, by people willing to ask the inconvenient question early instead of answering it, exhausted and too late, after the fleets were already moving. Vel O'Shanty kept her own record of it, in the end, the way astronomers tend to keep records of things too large to fully explain. Not a war record. A weather record. 41 millimeters over the Caldrec Basin on the night it all began, and, for months and 1 very strange war later, a second entry beside it. 28 millimeters over Halden's Rest. Scheduled, expected, and entirely unremarkable, except for the 11,000 people who had stood outside to watch it fall. She left the 2 entries side by side in the observatory's public log without commentary because she had decided, after a great deal of thought, and against her own professional instincts toward caution, that some numbers told their own story better than any report she could write to explain them.